was testifying at trial, he made a point to say that if anybody saw that K, they would have no idea or make no connection to Kiao, because even though Kiao was her given name, everyone knew her as Jit, Jitt. And his exact words at trial were that K would have meant nothing to anyone because everyone thinks her name is Jit.
Okay, well, that's important to know. Cool. But if the person who put them in the mailbox was somebody related to the killer, perhaps a mother or a wife or a girlfriend of the killer, they may have felt bad about it and returned them. In other words, it could be an indicator of remorse on the part of the killer, but it could also be an indicator of remorse on the part of somebody who knew the killer.
Right. And one thing that a lot of listeners have suggested, and I'd like to have your take on, a couple of listeners have suggested that maybe it wasn't about remorse and it was more about intimidation. Does that make any sense to you?
I don't know. I mean, unless there was some kind of pointed threat that either preceded or followed it, I don't see how the keys being in the mailbox would be an intimidating factor. Seems like a very high-risk behavior for somebody to do without a real pointed. I mean, it actually does them a service rather than a disservice.
Right.
If the keys are still missing, then I would change all my locks, right? I mean,
right.
Somebody might break in, but the fact that they're found, they're back. And if there's a bunch of keys, I don't know what the other keys were for, but obviously that's something that may have made it life a little more difficult had they not gotten them back.
Right. Yeah. I didn't see the intimidation side of it too, but I was just curious what your thoughts were on it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I just don't see evidence of it. It's a good theory, but I don't see evidence to back it up at this point. So the fact that there is no sexual assault, the fact that her ring, I guess it's a gold ring, was it a diamond ring or?
It was some kind of precious stone, but when I was reading through one of the reports this week, it wasn't actually a diamond. It was some kind of other stone, but it was her wedding ring.
Okay, so yeah, but that was left on her hand. So it kind of rules out robbery as a motive, at least not a completed robbery anyway. But the fact is that when I'm looking at the autopsy report and these pictures and the crime scene pictures and the crime descriptions, I can tell you that this definitely looks like a very dynamic crime scene. It's a dynamic attack. In other words, it's not static. It does not look to me like it was a blitz attack in which Kiao was incapacitated and then stabbed to death. I believe this was a ongoing crime scene, and most likely it involved more than one location. In other words, she was mobile and the attacker was mobile, and I think that they moved from one location to another location, and the final location is where she actually passed away. But I don't believe that it necessarily happened all in that place. I think that might be why the keys were not found, and it's very possible that some other person found them and returned them, or that they were taken by the offender and somebody else returned them to her mailbox.
So far, you and I are pretty spot on, because I agree. I don't think that she was attacked right there. It doesn't appear to me that it was a quick attack that started and stopped in one place either.
No, I can tell you definitely it didn't happen that way, because I believe as we go through these stab wounds that there are some of them that are completely inconsistent with having happened at the same time in the same orientation. In other words, one of the things that you have to understand when you're reading an autopsy report and when you're looking at the directionality of stab wounds and even bullet wounds to a certain extent, it's not necessarily it's not a direct relationship to where the person is. Because both people, if she was unconscious, she wouldn't be able to move. But I don't believe she was knocked unconscious. I don't believe that she was immobile at any time. I think, you have defensive wounds here, and that indicates that she was alive and fighting for her life. And because of that, she can move with respect to the attacker as well as the attacker moving with respect to her. So I think that we have to keep that in mind as we're looking through and trying to figure out where these stab wounds came from.
Right.
So one of the problems it's a necessary problem, but one of the problems is that the ME has numbered these stab wounds and cuts. And the problem is that it kind of puts in your mind sort of an order. This ME did not make any attempt to sequence these wounds. I would, if I were you, bring this information to a medical examiner like Dr. Werner Spitz, who is very adept at evaluating the sequence of the wounds. Problem is, I don't think that this medical examiner, or it's actually a team of MEs that did this. I believe it was signed off on by 4 different medical examiners. And I think that they did not make any attempt to determine the timing of these wounds or the separation of them in time. And that's unfortunate, because I think that would have told a much more rich story in terms of crime scene reconstruction. It's very difficult without that kind of information. For example, her aorta was severed by stab wound number 4. Her heart was pierced by stab wound number 3, I believe it was. And so the timing of those are critically important. Did she bleed out from those 2 wounds, or had she already bled out from earlier wounds? There just isn't any information about that. There isn't. I didn't see any pictures of her clothing or where the wounds bled the most and all that. None of that seems to be there. Was any of that in the trial transcript?
No, the trial transcripts is basically reciting almost exactly what's in the report.
I mean, don't you find that ridiculous that they never took a picture of her fully clothed? They never did any kind of description as to what wounds bled and what wounds didn't, or how much any particular wound bled. And why didn't they document that?
Yeah, it's extremely frustrating. And I'm hoping that when I get the police file, that maybe some of those photos will be there, because they weren't in the prosecutor's file, or they at least weren't admitted into trial.
Well, I think that probably what happened was that the EMTs probably cut off her clothes because she was bleeding from multiple places, and they were trying to address it in the process of transporting her and seeing if they could revive her or keep her alive. But they didn't call her dead at the scene, right?
Correct. She was pronounced dead at the hospital about 45 minutes later.
And they had rendered some assistance. Did they put a IV in? Did they try to open the air?
Yeah, at the time of the autopsy, it was indicated, I think in the reporter, it might have been the trial transcripts, that she had IVs in both arms and an oropharyngeal airway inserted into her mouth. So they were working her.
So it's possible that they cut all that stuff off before she even got to the hospital, and that's why. So the cops that responded arrived just after they were taking her away, so they didn't really have an opportunity to look at or photograph the condition of her body.
Right. It makes it pretty difficult because as the first officer, who was a trainee, showed up on the scene, the EMTs were just putting her on the backboard, taking her away. So, they had to reconstruct the crime scene without her. Well,
I'm going to say that I believe that the stab wounds on her back most likely preceded the stab wounds on her front, and that she ended up on her back kicking the attacker or attackers, and that's how she got stab wounds number 12 and 13 on her right buttock and her right thigh. I believe she was either on the ground kicking up at them, and the killer would have stabbed downward, which then appears upward on, as the body is laid out.
Right.
And that had to have happened while she was on her back. And so I believe that those stab wounds on her back must have already occurred.
Right, I agree.
And then the stab wounds, and particularly because she was found with her knees in an upward pointing position, I believe that is consistent with her having kicked at the attacker. In other words, just the probability that that happened after, for example, that she was stabbed on the front, then stabbed on the back, and then stabbed in the buttocks. I just don't see that happening, especially since there are two very fatal wounds on her chest. I believe they may have been delivered last. And obviously, it would be extremely telling to know if the blood spatter on her outer clothing was analyzed. I mean, did they do any of that? Did you see any of that?
If they did any of that, it's not documented.
Yeah, well, that would tell a story, whether she was upright, whether she was vertical or horizontal, whether she was partially upright, whether she was on the ground with her legs kicking up in the air. It's also possible some of the directionality of these wounds could be consistent with Dr. Lee's theory in the Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson murders, that somebody was holding Ron Goldman from behind while somebody else was attacking him from the front with a knife. That's another way in which somebody could be stabbed in their buttocks and thigh in a downward motion that would then appear to be an upward motion in this diagram. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, so like if they were holding her and then she was kicking her feet up at them?
Yeah, like that's a defensive wound, like curling up into a ball, first of all. Somebody's got you around the arms, pinning your arms to your side and your chest, across your chest. Then bringing your knees up so they covered your chest is a protective move. And also kicking out is a protective move. So it's possible that they stabbed her while she was in that kind of a huddled position or trying to kick them. And I do believe that that is an indicator that the person that did those stab wounds is right-handed.
Okay, so if her back was to them, yeah, that would be their right hand coming at her.
No, it was because her front was to them.
Right.
And her legs were up. So her buttocks would have been exposed. But the stab wounds are slightly, if I'm not mistaken, let me just look at your diagram here. They're in an upward direction, but the point of the knife is, in order to actually see what it's like, it would be like if you fold that picture in half, at her waist and turn it upside down so that the legs are now up in the air, that's what she would look like if she was being held from behind and she brought her legs up. And then the stabs are right to left going downward, which in the diagram then become stabs that look like they're going in an upward direction. But remember that the hips also can rotate and move from side to side. So directionality, again, it's not as definitive as you might think, because if somebody is completely immobile, that's one thing. But if somebody isn't, the hip joint can move, the waist can move, each leg can move. And I believe this was a dynamic crime scene. In other words, she was fighting with them the whole time. I don't believe that she was just passive at any time during this. And I believe she may have gotten away once or twice. And that's why you see discontinuity in the directionality of the blade, which direction the sharp end was, and also the directionality of how the blade entered her body. So you should definitely think about its moving pieces, but there is a possibility that there is more than one knife being used here, one of them being 3/4 of an inch wide and one of them being up to 1 3/4 inches, I think, is the widest wound that we have here. Am I right with that?
Yeah, 1 3/8.
Okay. So there's a possibility that those were made by the same knife, because if it goes in 3/4 of an inch and then the hand that's putting it in or the body that it's in moves, it could be dragged out and cut that whole opening wider. So we know that it's a minimum of 3/4 of an inch wide blade, but it's also possible to be wider. Do you understand? Am I making myself clear?
Well, wouldn't it be that it couldn't, if it was one knife, that it couldn't be bigger or wider than 3/4? Like the smaller knife could make the bigger wounds, but a bigger knife couldn't make the smaller wounds.
Correct. It has to be a minimum of 3/4 inch wide a maximum 3/4 inch wide knife that made several of the wounds.